Welcome to Chapter 4, where you will be learning about early childhood. In this module, you're going to be learning about physical development, cognitive development, and psychosocial development. Some of the things that you'll learn about that are related to physical development include physical growth and brain growth, motor skill development, toilet training, and nutrition. Some of the things that you'll be learning about that are related to cognitive development include some major theories of development, including Piaget's theory and Vygotsky's theory. You'll also learn about theory of mind and language development and education. And then you'll be learning about psychosocial development. And some of the things that you'll be learning that are related to that include Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. As you'll remember, you've learned about that theory in infancy. You learned about trust versus mistrust and autonomy versus shame and doubt. So we'll be continuing to learn about that theory. And as you do, I'd encourage you to think about your own upbringing and what you developed or what experiences you had as you were growing that contributed to your progression through each of those stages. You'll also be learning about family relationships, play, and moral development. Those are just a few of the things that you'll be learning about in this module. In the first part of this video, we're going to be looking at physical growth, and you're going to be learning about the physical changes that are taking place in early childhood. You'll also be learning about the changes in brain maturation that happen during this stage of development. You'll learn too about the characteristics and stages of sleep and the changes in gross and fine motor skills in early childhood. You'll also be learning about nutrition during this stage. So let's get started. Before we get started, I thought I'd ask you these questions just to get you thinking about what you may have been told as a child by your parent or caregiver. And I wonder why parents may make up some of these stories. Do they believe these stories, or are they just telling their children these stories for some other reason? And I wonder what you think, if any, the effect of saying these things might have on children. So here are a few that I came across in a couple of different articles that I thought I'd share with you. I know for me, I remember being told things like wait an hour after eating to swim, and this was really upsetting for me as a child, but yet the American Red Cross says there is no reason for kids or anyone to wait for an hour, but still our parents, probably many of you, your parents were telling you this. Here's another, your nose will grow if you lie, having its origins in Pinocchio. Did you believe these kinds of stories that your parents told you, like that one, or that eating carrots will help you see in the dark? I remember being told that if I ate spinach, it would make me have more muscles. The one that really frightened me was gum staying in my stomach for 7 years. So I wonder, what do you think the effects of these myths are on children when parents share these with their children? Is it that children believe them and then later, as they develop and finally do come to realize that they're not true, that it has really no impact? Or do you think it may have an effect on how children see their parents and how they see honesty? Does it have any effect on that? Will you make up any of these stories with your children? Why do you think parents say these things? Do you think they really believe these things? Or do you think they're just saying certain things like this to have an effect on child behavior? With that being said, let's go ahead and move on and begin this first part of our module on child physical development. During this stage of development, the average 2-year-old weighs anywhere from about 23 to 28 pounds and is anywhere between 33 to 35 inches tall. That's just the average, and of course there are going to be children who fall outside of that norm. From ages 2 to 6, children grow about 3 inches in height and gain 4 to 5 pounds per year. There's also a slower growth rate happening during this period than there is in infancy. I think it's also important to note that since there is this slower growth rate, it would make sense that appetite decreases from ages 2 to 6. When a child is about 3 years of age, the weight of their brain is about 75% of the weight of the adult brain. and their brain weight by age 6 is 95% of the adult brain weight. Growth of the brain is caused by myelination and the development of dendrites. If you'll remember, myelin is the tissue that insulates brain cells with a sheath that helps to ensure clear transmission across the synapses. The reason that young children process information slower than adults is because their brain cells lack the amount of myelin needed for quicker transmission of nerve impulses. A child's experiences throughout infancy and throughout early childhood affect the rate and growth of myelin all the way through their development and actually into young adulthood. And if you'll remember also, dendrites are those branch-like structures that are part of the neuron and they receive incoming information from neighboring neurons. They actually receive incoming information by way of neurotransmitters. So there's a development of more dendrites occurring during this stage of development. During this stage, you're also going to see greater development or increased development of the prefrontal cortex. Now, the brain is not fully developed until we're about 25 years of age. And the last part of the brain to develop is the frontal lobe, which is where the prefrontal cortex is. But it is continuing to develop during this stage. So we're going to see improvements in attention continue, planning, and inhibition. Inhibition meaning the ability to control impulses and regulate behavior. Now, these are not automatic improvements or changes, I should say. This does depend on learning and environmental circumstances. So while children are ready to develop the ability to control their attention, they're not always going to develop that unless you have some intervention, meaning that parents are helping children to learn to regulate themselves. So you won't see as much of a growth in this area in children whose parents aren't helping them to develop these abilities or who aren't modeling those types of skills than you would see in children who are having those types of experiences. So learning is such an important part of brain development. Also during this stage, we see the hemispheres growing, both the left and right hemispheres. And so this then results in improvements in language and also improvements in spatial skills. The corpus callosum is also developing, and this then results in improved coordination and communication because the corpus callosum, if you'll remember, it connects the right and left hemispheres. It's extremely important for communication that takes place between the right and left side of the brain. Also, during infancy and early childhood, the brain is extremely plastic, meaning that the brain has the ability to change structure and function in response to experience and damage. So if a child were to suffer from brain injury in this stage of development, they're much more apt to recover than, let's say, an older adult, because the brain of a child in infancy, early childhood, toddlerhood, early childhood, middle childhood is much more plastic. In other words, if one part of the brain is damaged during this stage of development, then other parts of the brain are better able to compensate for that particular injury. And this is an image taken from your textbook, and you can see here we have the right and the left hemisphere, and in between we have the corpus callosum. So the right hemisphere is controlling the left side of the body and its movement. The left hemisphere is controlling the right side of the body. Of course, the right and left hemispheres do a lot more than that, but just as an example, think about how important it is for you to be able to coordinate the movement of both the right and left side of your body. So by being able to coordinate this movement, you're able to easily walk, you're able to tie your shoes, you're able to do things that involve both your right and left side of your body, your right and left hands, for example. And you don't have to watch what both hands are doing. You can experience the benefits of the corpus callosum because you are able to look at other things while your right and left hands are doing something like tying your shoes. Of course, in early childhood, children are learning to tie their shoes. It's going to take them looking at their hands as they're tying their shoes, but it's so much easier for them because of the corpus callosum allowing for that communication to take place. And as that continues to develop, we have enhanced communication. Imagine if you didn't have the corpus callosum. Imagine how difficult it would be for communication to take place. You'd have to be watching everything that the other hand was doing while you were doing something with your right hand and you wanted your left hand to be involved in that action. So we take this for granted. It's important not just, of course, in movement, it's important in everything that we're doing that involves the coordination of the right and left hemispheres. In early childhood, we see a significant progression in motor skills, specifically related to, for example, locomotion. So we see that the ability to do things like run and jump and skip, those continue to improve and those skills continue to develop. If we look, for example, at a 2-year-old, they tend to have a fairly hurried walk instead of a true run, and they move their legs pretty stiffly rather than bending them at the knees. And they're not airborne, as in like what you would see with true running. But by 5 or 6 years of age, children can run easily, quickly changing their direction or speed. Object control skills are harder for kids to master, and so this takes a bit more time. And this is because they're more complex and challenging than motor skills that don't involve objects. So they develop after other gross motor skills like running, jumping, and skipping. So while children are first learning manipulative skills, the goal isn't necessarily complete accuracy, hitting a ball right at a target, for example, or throwing it at another player in a game. They first need to learn the basic action before they can fine tune it. I think I'd also like to note that if any parent is worried about their child's physical development, including their mastery of locomotion, manipulative skills, object control, it's important for the parent to talk with their doctor. The child might be right in line with where other children are, and the parent may not realize this, or the child might benefit from some early intervention, perhaps physical or occupational therapy. Practicing these skills at home can also be helpful. So for example, as you're helping your child to learn those object control skills, you could start with a large beach ball or a large soft foam ball, and then you could challenge the child to kick that ball with their preferred foot and then to switch to the other foot. So you could do this at home and just regularly practice this type of skill. You could try things like bowling. So at home, you could just start with large lightweight pins. You don't have to buy these things. You could just get some empty 2-liter soda bottles, and then you could, add weight to the large bottles to, help them to stand up. And then you could give the child a ball, and then encourage the child to roll that ball towards the bottles. You also could help children to develop these types of skills by helping them to or encouraging them to play musical instruments. And it doesn't have to be an instrument that a parent purchases. It could be just doing things like drumming on pots and pans with spoons. A parent could do this with, they could give these objects to their child while they're cooking in the kitchen. And these are just very easy to implement opportunities throughout the day. We don't have to have necessarily structured time. Just while you're doing things or while a parent is, it can be helpful to introduce these things throughout the day, keeping the child busy and doing things that are good for their brain development. During early childhood, children are refining their fine motor skills. And if you'll remember, fine motor skills are the coordination of small muscle movements. These usually involve small, precise thumb, finger, hand, and wrist movements. And fine motor activity when a child is young helps children to refine things like their pincher grasp. And this is grasping an object with their thumb and pointer finger using their preferred hand. And this is a precursor to handwriting. And by doing things like practicing picking up, manipulating, exercising the small muscles in the palm of their hands. Children are actually developing the ability to gain control and strength while coloring, for example, drawing, cutting, forming letters, and then writing when it's age appropriate. And many children who don't have strong fine motor skills become more easily frustrated when they're doing tasks that require writing. And this can affect a child's feelings of self-worth. It can lead to some anxiety and stress. And if a parent does not, or let's say that the child doesn't get intervention and the child is outside of what's typical development, then there's going to be an increased likelihood that the child's written schoolwork might be, might not be very legible as they move into, first and second grade. And then this can continue to affect how a child feels. So early intervention is really key. There are lots of children who receive early intervention services, and they are wonderful. They are great for helping children to meet those milestones so that they can develop and really maximize or fulfill their potential in all of these different areas. There are a lot of things that parents can do and teachers can do, siblings can do with children during this age to help children to develop these skills. Think about, for some of you, when you were children, maybe you played games like Operation. I know my kids still really enjoy that game. Even though, they're 8 years old, I find them picking that game up and wanting to play. My daughter, who's 4, she really likes playing Operation. Games like Light Bright, that's kind of an old school game, but kids like that. Think of the little lights that are in that machine or that in that game, and you can easily get that. You don't have to go spend a lot of money on these things. You can, parents or teachers can find these at garage sales and on, online on Marketplace. So there are a lot of very easy ways to integrate these sorts of games into everyday life. And then also, I think doing things like playing with beads. So I know with my kids, I would use some larger beads to begin with when they were really young, and then we moved on to smaller beads. And they really like doing that because I might get things like beads with letters, and they could put their names, or we could make their names and put it onto their backpack. Also, helping children to practice these skills can be done by letting kids do things like help teachers in schools to set the table. So doing things like having children bring the forks and knives over to the table. Of course, this would be at the very early ages, and then begin using a fork and a knife as they get a little bit older. So they're developing those bilateral skills. So that's really the coordination then between the right and left hemispheres. You'll also see that during this stage, there are a series of stages of development that children go through in terms of drawing. And drawing is a form of pre-literacy. It's a pre-literacy skill. We often think of literacy as reading, but literacy is not just reading. Literacy is all forms of communication. So this could be things like verbal communication. It could also be things like drawing, like you're seeing here. This is a way of communicating. It also can be in more formal ways, like in the letter system that we use. So as children are learning to draw, as they're developing these skills, they are approximating letters, and the more that they have this practice, then the easier it's going to be for them is that as they get into those stages where they're going to be asked by their teachers to write letters. So giving those opportunities to practice this is great. And you'll see that even biologically, there are some predispositions that we have to go through a series of stages. So as your book points out, tadpoles, for example, at age 3, they're very common cross-culturally. And when we see something happening cross-culturally, that tells us that biology is playing an important role. And I'd also like to point out that if you think about it, letters, of course, are symbolic because they have meaning and they can be used to convey meaning. If we join letters together, for example, and even just individually, a letter has meaning or can have meaning. Like, for example, the letter I has meaning. So think about a drawing that a child makes. So like this drawing right here. that child is conveying meaning to their parent or whoever they're drawing this picture for. So this is another, I think this should help you to think about drawings as a way of promoting literacy, very connected to literacy development, because children are communicating using symbols, these images, or whatever it is that they're drawing. And at first it may not be very legible. You don't know exactly what they're drawing, but it can be really interesting for you to ask the child, what are they drawing, or to tell you about that. I know for myself, I like to ask my child, instead of what is that, I like to ask her questions like, hey, can you tell me about that? Or I really like how you did this. Try to be careful about saying things like, what is that? Because I don't want her to think that I'm not able to understand, that she's not effectively communicating, because she's communicating within the confines of her abilities for her age. So I like to ask her again things like, tell me more about that, or I really like how you did such and such, instead of, oh, that's beautiful. Of course, I do sometimes say that to her, but I want to be more specific. And I also think it's important when we're thinking about child growth and development. We'll be looking at something later on called the growth mindset. And when you think about child growth, it's so important for children to have a growth mindset. And what that means is that they are not defined by the adjectives that we provide them. So they are not defined by things like, I'm smart, I'm good at art, I'm good at math. They instead see themselves as being in control of their abilities. So things like, oh, you worked so hard. I'm so proud of how hard you worked. Or I noticed how focused you were when you were drawing. And so when you focus on those types of qualities, children feel a greater sense of control, so that when their performance later on is not lining up with what you've told them as their parent, it doesn't feel so anxiety provoking. A child who has grown up always being told, for example, that they're smart, and then suddenly they're struggling, is going to have a lot of trouble. And everyone struggles. We all do in some way in our lives. If we're never struggling, we're probably not pushing ourselves. So we want kids to push themselves. And for them to do so, they need to know that what is most desired is not that you have the most perfect, wonderful outcome. You're smart, your work is beautiful, but that you're very focused, you're a hard worker. That gives them that greater sense of control. So we're going to be looking at that later on, but keep that in mind. I think the growth mindset is so important. And if you're interested in learning more about this, you can just do a simple internet search and you can find lots of great resources on this. And they can be beneficial for you too. I know that many of you in this course are not parents. The majority of you are not, but you may eventually become a parent. But I can tell you that probably even sooner than that, you're going to end up, many of you, having interactions with children, whether it be in your profession, for those of you who are going into healthcare or education, or perhaps even with nieces and nephews or siblings. And so I think having this knowledge can be so helpful as we think about how we want to approach children and what we want to talk about them with and share with them. During early childhood, children learn a self-care skill that gives them some independence, and this is toilet training. And in theory, children could be ready for toilet training as early as age 2, because most babies of this age, or most children of this age, recognize the urge to need to use the bathroom. Before this point, most infants just aren't simply able to physiologically monitor and control using the bathroom. So, in other words, very young children and toddlers can't tell that they have to go before it's too late, and they're unable to control whether or not they go to the bathroom. And so, this is an important part of early childhood, because the child is learning to not only control their body, but they're also learning to do that at the same time as being able to recognize their needs, and there's this gradual independence that's taking place. I think it's important to note too that this is a focus of Sigmund Freud's second stage of psychosexual development. He suggests that that's the main focus that's happening during the second stage when a child's this age, and that when a child doesn't have any structure to this particular skill, so in other words, the parents don't do really much of anything to help the child to develop that skill, or if the parents are overly rigid and the child's not ready to be toilet trained, that the child could develop what Freud called a fixation. And a fixation means that the child develops characteristics that are reflective of that stage. So they're in essence sort of becoming stuck in that stage. And you may have heard phrases like anal retentive or anal expulsive. We'll look at this a little bit later. You did learn about these phrases earlier in your first module, but so I wanted to bring up toilet training here because of Freud, but also, of course, because it is a very important part of development that's happening during early childhood. Learned sleep is of significant importance throughout the lifespan, and you've learned about infancy and the need for sleep during that stage. And you also learned that children spend a lot of time sleeping in infancy, and one of the things that they're spending a lot of time doing is they're spending a lot of time in REM, and this is because REM is the time of memory consolidation. And so because infants are learning so much, they're going to be spending a lot of time in this period of sleep. And when we think about what infants are learning, they're learning about everything in their world, from sight to sounds to textures. Well, that learning continues as we move into early childhood. It's certainly not as intense as it was during infancy. So the sleep needs typically decline a bit between ages 2 and 6, but sleep is still of critical importance. Poor sleep is associated with cognitive and attention problems, and sometimes these issues of poor sleep can be misdiagnosed as ADHD. Research has also found that sleep problems during early childhood have shown to be adversely affected to or related to things like growth and body mass index and blood pressure. And of course, as I mentioned, behavioral issues, which are related to attention. But think also about being a child's ability to control their behavior. That's a symptom of ADHD when a child has difficulty doing this. And so this can be due to poor sleep. So it is important that if a parent is concerned about their child's behavior, perhaps attention issues, focus issues, impulse control, hyperactivity, which sometimes can be a sign of ADHD, that they look at some of the potential factors that could be contributing to it that may be outside of ADHD. It could be ADHD for sure, but it could also be that there are other things going on that could be adjusted that could lead to some improvements for the child. And here's a nice diagram from the Sleep Foundation, and you'll see that the needs for sleep decline throughout the lifespan, and you can see how high those needs are in newborns who are 0 to 3 months of age. And then as we move into toddlerhood and preschool, those sleep needs have declined somewhat. So we'll be looking at sleep in each stage of development. And these stages of sleep, not only do we see changes in the quantity of sleep, but we also see changes in the stages of sleep. So in infancy, we see a disproportionate amount of time spent in REM. And now as we move into toddlerhood and preschool and into those early school years, we see less time spent in REM compared to infancy. Children's dietary and nutritional requirements differ from those of adults, and this is of course because they're growing. I do want to point out that it's very normal for kids at this age to be picky and to have a reluctance to try new food. They often have a preference for a limited range of foods. And if we look at human history, this makes sense. So think about your ancestors. Go back 50, 100 generations ago. So go back many, many years ago and think about what would have been adaptive for children, 50, 100 generations ago or earlier than that. It would have been adaptive for them to be picky, for them to be a bit selective, because if they weren't, they may have tried foods that could have been dangerous for them. So that tendency to be particular or a bit reluctant was adaptive. And if you think about human history and we think about our current genetic profile as humans, we have pretty much the same DNA as our ancestors did that many generations ago. So it takes a lot of time for there to be changes within our overall DNA pool. And So it makes perfect sense if you have a child who's a bit picky. I know one of my children is pretty particular. I have to remind myself that this is pretty typical. However, I do want to say that when a child is particular, it is so important that if the child's not getting adequate nutrition, so perhaps their diet's a bit imbalanced, it's so important for them to be taking nutritional supplements or for the parent to try and find ways to get those nutrients in as much as possible. That's the most ideal. So it may be that when they bake items, for example, I know, for example, for myself, I like to make baked items that have some hidden vegetables in them so that my kids don't notice them. And it's, of course, I want my kids to get used to eating vegetables, but one of them is a little bit reluctant to try several different vegetables that I want him to eat. And so I need to make sure he gets that nutrition. So there's lots of helpful resources out there. If you are a parent or if you're going into a healthcare field or education, I think it will be helpful, especially if you're working with children, to be aware of those resources, since this is a pretty typical, pretty common issue. And it's so important to find ways to get nutrition in because nutrients are essential for growth and they become more important in children. They're more important in children probably than we would say they are in adults. And so it is challenging, though, to help children to get those nutritional needs met on a daily basis. And some of the reasons that children may have these issues, again, it can be just because they're children and it's pretty typical, and they will often outgrow these kind of particular behaviors, but some children don't. Some children may have allergies or intolerances. Some children may have vitamin deficiencies, which can affect appetite. I think like if a child has, for example, a zinc deficiency, I've read that that can affect appetite. So it's important to talk with a pediatrician to find out what might be causing those issues. And your pediatrician or the pediatrician, if we're talking about just children in general, can then refer the parent to a nutritionist. And that nutritionist then can help to provide some guidance and help the parent and child to reach some goals. It is so important because when children don't eat proper, if they're not getting the amount of nutrition that they need, especially if they're not getting the calories that they need, they can develop what's called failure to thrive. And this happens when a child has a weight or their weight gain is not in line with children of the same age, and they may appear much shorter or smaller than others that are at their typical development. And because of this, the child may even have a delay of puberty. And while failure to thrive can be a symptom of medical conditions, these could include, for example, chronic infections. It could also be chromosomal abnormalities. So sometimes that's what can cause failure to thrive. Having poor nutrition can also play a pretty significant role. So there are things that are within that parent's control. Of course, when your child's not eating, it can be very difficult to get them to eat. And that's I think it can be a very challenging issue for parents. And if you are a parent in this group, or you work with parents who have children in this group, there's a lot of great resources out there. I think one thing that I'd like to note is that children feel that they don't have a whole lot of control in their life. And so it's very normal for them to want to find the areas that they can control. And food is one of them. It's very hard to make a child eat something. You can't really make them eat something. And so this is an area where they can have control. And so getting into a battle with a child and, trying to tell them, you have to eat, you have to do these things, is often a battle that a parent or caregiver is not going to win. So eating needs to be a positive experience. It's important that parents make sure that there's always something at the dinner table that the child does like, at least one item, so that eating is a positive event for them. Children need to believe that if they try something and that they don't like it, that they don't have to even swallow it. That way, they're not afraid of trying those new foods. Also, when we think about trying new foods, there are some estimates that suggest that it could take up to 15 tries of a particular food for a kid to feel like, hey, I think I can continue eating this. So there are a lot of good resources that can provide suggestions like the ones I just provided, but it is so important to talk with a pediatrician to make sure that the child's nutritional needs are being met and that the child is not anemic and that they're not vitamin deficient in other areas. So food refusal overall is a big contributor to poor nutrition in children. And sometimes it can be because of a dislike of certain textures, and this can be related to sensory issues that a child might have. Some children have sensory issues where they don't like certain textures. Some of you may have been this way when you were children. You might not have liked the way certain foods felt in your mouth, and it might have just felt really bad to you. And so that's something that parents have to consider, and they may need to change the type of food that they're serving or the way that they're preparing that food. Sometimes children who have autism can also be prone to these types of sensory issues, which can make getting good nutrition a significant challenge, especially when we think of autism and we think about the autism spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, where you see more severe autism, there can be some more behaviors or fixated behaviors, and so the child may not only be have sensory issues, but they may want the same types of food each day and not really want much variety at all, and get very distressed when there is a deviation from what the child's normally given. And I think allergies are another important issue. This is when, of course, allergies often are identified before this stage, but they're not always. And most of the common allergies include eggs and milk and peanuts. Also, gluten and lactose intolerances can be a factor. So those things may be causing some of the food issues that a child has. And then when a child is not getting adequate nutrition, this can lead to iron deficiency anemia. And this is where the body doesn't have enough healthy red blood cells. And when a child has a diet that's lacking in iron, this is the most common cause of anemia. And typically, this is happening when children, if we think about the most common time it happens, it's usually around 9 to 24 months, where a child may have a diet that's very full of milk and not much iron-rich foods. But for some children, especially those with sensory issues, they may be in this stage of early childhood, past infancy and toddlerhood, and have anemia because of those food issues, because of the particular, because they're fairly particular with food. So overall, it is so important for parents to talk with their doctor about these issues. And it's also important for parents not to force this issue on the child. There are many great resources. I found one that I thought would be very helpful. I'll post this under the supplementary materials, and it's actually a research study that parents can participate in. And then what they can do if they participate is they then can download an app, and the app provides parents with resources and some guidance, and also some really good opportunities for recognizing what foods their child likes so that they can come up with a plan with their children. So I'll be sure to post that on our course website under the supplemental materials. So what have you learned so far? Well, you've learned about the overall characteristics of physical growth in early childhood and some of the changes in brain maturation that are happening during this period of time. You've also learned about the changes in sleep in early childhood and the changes in gross and fine motor skills during this stage. And then you've also learned about nutrition in early childhood and that it's fairly common. It's not the norm, but it's certainly pretty common if we think about what, if we look at still within the range of, what's pretty typical behavior is for children to have a bit of pickiness when it comes to eating. And so we looked at some of the things that parents and caregivers can do. So what's next? In our next video, we're going to be exploring cognitive development. You'll learn about Piaget's second stage of preoperational development. You'll also be looking at Vygotsky's theory of development. You'll look at memory and you'll look at attention. You'll look at language development. These are just a few things that you'll be learning about in our next video. I look forward to seeing each of you online. And as always, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me with any questions that you have.